They said she was lying because of her accent, her silence, her skin, but the moment the classroom door opened and a 4-star general stepped inside, every smirk collapsed into terror. If you believe truth always finds its voice, hit subscribe now, because stories like this expose power, prejudice, and the kind of justice that changes lives forever. The first thing Amara noticed about Westbridge Academy wasn't the ivy-covered brick or the polished hallways that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old money, it was the silence that followed her wherever she went, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but measuring, as if eyes were weighing her worth before she ever spoke, and she learned quickly that staying quiet made it worse, because in a place where confidence was currency, her calm reserve was mistaken for weakness, and that misunderstanding settled heavily in room 214 where Mrs. Helen Crowley ruled with a voice sharpened by decades of unchecked authority, a teacher celebrated for discipline and high standards, but feared by students who learned early that her approval came with conditions not written in any handbook. And on Amara's third week, when a history assignment went missing from the submission tray, Mrs. Crowley's gaze landed on her like a verdict already decided, asking in a tone that wasn't really a question whether Amara had turned in her work, and when Amara said softly that she had, that she remembered placing it neatly beneath the others, the teacher's smile curved into something thin and cold, remarking how convenient it was that the new girl, the one with the foreign name and careful words, claimed innocence, prompting a ripple of quiet laughter that pressed against Amara's ribs until breathing felt like effort, and when Amara reached into her bag to show the backup copy she always kept, because moving countries had taught her to be prepared, Mrs. Crowley waved it away, declaring copies meaningless, insisting that honesty was learned early and apparently not learned everywhere, and that single sentence fractured something fundamental, because it wasn't just about homework anymore, it was about identity, about being labeled a liar in a room where no one looked like her. And when Amara's cheeks burned and her throat tightened, she didn't cry or argue, she simply said she would accept whatever consequence was fair, which Mrs. Crowley translated as an admission of guilt, assigning detention and announcing it loudly as a lesson for others, unaware that in the back row a boy named Ethan watched with unease because he had seen the paper earlier, had even moved it aside to retrieve his own, and though he considered speaking up, the weight of Mrs. Crowley's reputation pinned him silent, and the bell rang, releasing the class into whispers that followed Amara down the corridor, whispers about liars and charity placements and how they always play the victim, none of which Mrs. Crowley heard as she straightened the papers and found, minutes later, Amara's original assignment tucked beneath a folder, and instead of calling Amara back or correcting the record, she slid it into the pile, choosing reputation over responsibility, never imagining that this small cruelty had already begun unraveling her carefully protected world. Detention stretched into weeks of subtle punishment, lowered participation grades, sarcastic remarks disguised as rigor, and Amara learned to shrink further, but she also learned something else, that her grandmother's words about dignity weren't platitudes but survival tools, so she kept her head high and her records immaculate, unaware that the school's annual civic assembly was approaching, an event where distinguished guests spoke about service and leadership, and this year's speaker was listed simply as General R. K. Williams, a name that meant nothing to most students until the morning of the assembly when security swept the halls and the headmaster's voice trembled slightly over the announcements, because General Raymond Knox Williams wasn't just any officer. He was a 4-star general whose career was studied at military academies, a man known for integrity so uncompromising it had ended friendships and exposed corruption, and Amara felt a strange tightening in her chest when she saw the name because she recognized it from framed photographs in her family home, because General Williams was her grandfather, the man who had taught her to listen more than she spoke and to stand still when storms passed through people instead of over them, and she hadn't planned to tell anyone, not the school, not even her friends, because she didn't want borrowed respect, but fate has a way of colliding truths, and during the assembly when the general spoke about honor being what you do when no one is watching, Mrs. Crowley sat rigid, applauding loudly, unaware that the story he told next, about a young girl accused falsely because she didn't fit expectations, wasn't abstract, and when the general asked to meet a student privately afterward, requesting the new student named Amara, a murmur rolled through the hall like a shifting tide, and Mrs. Crowley's confident posture cracked for the first time as realization crept in too late, because in the principal's office, with administrators standing stiffly along the wall, the general listened as Amara finally spoke, not angrily, not tearfully, but clearly, recounting dates, words, patterns, and evidence, and when Mrs. Crowley was invited to explain herself, she stumbled into defensiveness, then denial, then something uglier as she implied misunderstandings and sensitivities, each excuse tightening the general's jaw, and when he asked why the discovered assignment hadn't been acknowledged, the silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand, because silence is loud when truth is waiting. The reckoning was swift but precise, not the explosive humiliation some expected but the methodical exposure that leaves no room to hide. As an internal review unearthed years of complaints quietly dismissed, patterns of targeting masked as discipline, and the board convened with unusual urgency because institutions move quickly when their reflections become inconvenient, and Mrs. Crowley was placed on leave pending investigation, her authority evaporating overnight, while Amara was called into classrooms not to relive pain but to be heard, to show that quiet does not mean weak and dignity does not mean passive, and the general addressed the school one final time, reminding them that power tests character daily, not in grand battles but in small choices, like whether to correct a mistake or protect your pride. And when he finished, he didn't stand beside Amara as a shield but stepped back, letting her take the space on her own, and she did, speaking briefly about truth needing witnesses, about how one voice can be ignored but many can change a room, prompting Ethan to stand and apologize publicly, followed by others who found courage contagious at last, and the school changed not because a general walked in, but because when he did, people chose honesty over fear, and Amara learned that silence isn't absence, it's potential, and sometimes the room must freeze so justice can finally move.